Hello, friends. Welcome back. This is the fourth and final lecture in our opening module one. Recall that this opening lecture is less about technical skill and more about some of the philosophical and kind of the analytical ways that economists see the world. Hopefully, you have watched the three previous lectures, so you know the definition of economics, but hopefully you've really focused on the last two lectures and you've started to internalize some of those tenets, some of those key ways that economists see the world differently than other people. You know, issues tied to scarcity and choice and the idea of opportunity cost, the need for rationing, the need to make decisions and give some things up, and the fact that we make economic decisions by looking at marginal cost and marginal benefit in a process that we call marginal analysis. Really powerful. We've talked about the importance of trade and how trade creates win-wins, even though it's increasingly popular today to vilify or demonize, firms. And there's this idea that some people hold that for a firm to make money, they have to be screwing us over. Hopefully you're now thinking past that and you see that voluntary trade actually is a positive sum game. It's a win-win. And it's not just necessarily me going to Del Taco, but it's any transaction that adults voluntarily engage in to better themselves, okay? This is the basis for that big idea that we mentioned, that the pursuit of individual self-interest can actually align to society's overall benefit. And that's a pretty remarkable thing to think about. It all comes back, though, to the idea of incentive and win-win trade, to the idea of markets that bring buyers and sellers together, to the institutions that foster this cooperative, collaborative behavior, that foster trust, to things like private property rights, okay? So what I really want you to do as you wrap up this fourth lecture, and really we finish up module one and we get ready for module two and a bit more of an analytical look at economics, is I want you to always be looking in the real world. Up to now, I told you at the end of lecture one, lecture two, lecture three, to look at the real world to try to figure out when good economics happens. Good institutions, voluntary transactions, when you make decisions based on cost-benefit analysis and what you give up in the process, okay? So to make a good economics is not just about the theories, it's about applying those theories and finding economics everywhere. And I'm hoping that in this first week of class, you've been trying to do that. We're gonna wrap up today by going in the other direction. Whereas I've been teaching you prior to today some of the tenets, some of the key ways that economists see the world, this toolkit that we have to make predictions and to understand really complicated social phenomena. Today, we're going to outline a couple of pitfalls to good economic thinking. And these bullet points right here are some of the more common ways that people think incorrectly about economics. Let's jump into it really quickly. The very first pitfall to good economic thinking is a violation of the ceteris paribus assumption. This is a Latin phrase that basically at its core means other things equal. And ceteris paribus is an assumption that applies to most economic theorizing and decision making. Because when you make economic decisions and when you look at economics to try to make sense of things and make predictions with your models, you're really trying to isolate how one particular thing, event, or change will influence something else. Obviously, models are simplified representations of reality. But that's what we do in economics. So it's really important that when you're looking at models, that you understand what you're looking at, what the event or the change is, and what you're trying to predict or understand. And you hold constant all other changes, okay? The ceteris paribus assumption is a way in economics that we ensure that we're looking at the connection between one variable or change and its impact on something else. Again, in a highly complex world, we have to strip away lots of things and simplify our models. Ceteris paribus is how we do that, okay? If you violate the ceteris paribus assumption, you're not going to get good economic thinking because you won't be able to isolate and identify how one variable or one change affects something else, okay? So that's one big pitfall. Always remember ceteris paribus. It also makes, as a beginning economics student, it also makes your lives a little bit easier because you don't have to think through all those levels of political and economic complexity. You can isolate variables to look at their impact on each other and make predictions, okay? The second big pitfall to economic thinking is ignoring implicit costs. Now, we've already discussed this a little bit in the idea of opportunity cost, but I wanted to make clear a term here. In cost theory, there are two types of costs. There's explicit and there's implicit, okay? Explicit costs are costs where actual money exchanges hands. You know, in my Del Taco example, that $7 that I spent from my wallet to Mr. Del, that was actual money outlay. That's an explicit cost. When your boss hires you and you go to work and he pays you your wage or your salary, that's actual money changing hands. That's an explicit cost. Most people, economists or not, are very good at identifying explicit costs because it's easy to see when money changes hands. But what you need to remember is that in economics, it's not just about what you pay, it's about what you give up. So in economics, we have to look at explicit costs, how much money is exchanged for something, but we also have to remember to take into account those implicit, those kind of hidden, those opportunity costs. Those are everywhere. If you ask a lot of people, hey, you go to college, what's it cost you? They'll just say, oh, my tuition is $50,000 a year. I get 10 grand of aid. College cost me $40,000. And they'll say, oh, okay, good enough. An economist says, nope. An economist would ask this question. If you choose to go to college, you're also therefore choosing to not work full time and not earn a salary, right? That's an opportunity cost. So when you calculate your actual your actual cost of coming to LMU, it's not just about asking what am I spending explicitly in terms of tuition to go there. It's also what am I giving up? And if you could have gone out this year and made $40,000 at a job, you have to factor that foregone, that sacrifice, that lost income as a part of your true cost of college, okay? Because otherwise, you're going to underestimate your costs. And there's a lot of people who make a lot of bad economic decisions because they underestimate costs. When you ignore implicit costs, you're going to underestimate your total cost. And obviously, I taught you before that you make decisions by comparing marginal benefits to marginal costs. Well, if you aren't thinking through your full cost structure, you're not going to make a smart marginal benefit, marginal cost decision. Okay, a lot of people make a lot of bad decisions because they don't fully account for their costs because they're ignoring their implicit opportunity cost. I'll give you one more example. We talked about how when you come to college, you give up the chance to work full time. That's foregone income. How about those entrepreneurs who take out, you have an entrepreneur, imagine a business owner wants to start a business. He has $1 million in the bank and he pulls that money out to get a factory and to buy all of his materials. If that entrepreneur doesn't know economics, all he's going to look at is the money that comes in from his sales and the money that went out for his cost of production, and he'll calculate his profit accordingly. And to an accountant, that's correct. But to an economist, there are some implicit costs there. The economist would say, wait a minute, what are your opportunity costs? Before you started your own business, did you have another job? How much were you making there? Suppose that this guy had another job making $90,000 a year. When he quit that job to start his own business, that's an implicit cost, an opportunity cost of $90,000. You have to account for that to make a smart choice. Suppose he took $1 million out of his bank account, right? Lucky bastard. Took $1 million out of his bank account to buy his factory and stuff. The economist would have said, weren't you making interest on that money? How much money were you making every month or every year on interest at your bank? Because when you pulled that money out, you also pulled out, you gave up, you lost your opportunity to make interest income. So good economic thinking would say, hey, Mr. Entrepreneur, it's not just the amount that you're spending for labor and supplies and rent on your factory. How much salary did you give up, even though it's implicit? How much interest did you give up, even though it's implicit? You make a correct economic decision when you fully understand your cost. And to fully understand your cost, you cannot ignore the implicit ones. Tied to that is focusing on sunk cost. We have talked about this one a little bit earlier. You'll recall that a sunk cost in economics is defined as a decision that you've already made or a cost that you've already incurred that you're not going to recover. Sunk costs are in the past. And because they're in the past in economics, we say, hey, you're not going to get it back, and therefore they do not tie into your decision making. Your marginal cost and marginal benefit decisions, remember, marginal meant extra, right? Or additional or next. Sunk costs are in the past. And because they're in the past, they do not factor into economic decision making. Although a lot of people make bad economic decisions by bringing sunk costs into their analysis. Don't make that mistake. Another major pitfall to economic thinking is making the assumption that good intentions will generate good outcomes. I hate to break your hearts, my friends, but it doesn't always work that way. And in fact, we talked earlier about incentives. And we talked about incentives as being good things. But there's a whole other branch of economic thinking that looks at what they call perverse incentives. And perverse incentives occur when the incentives that are crafted, maybe through company policies or maybe through federal tax laws or whatever, any time that policies or rules provide messed up or flawed incentives, we call those perverse incentives. And we believe in economics that sometimes not only will assuming that good intentions generate good outcomes fail, but sometimes in economics, good intentions can lead to tragic outcomes if those good intentions are coupled with policies that create really, really bad incentives. You know, if you follow professional sports, for example, you may have been aware that in the last couple of decades, there's been increasing criticism about the use of steroids and other performance-enhancing drugs in lots of sports, right? Baseball, cycling, all these things. And purists get really mad and they cry and they say, oh, they're ruining the game. Well, it comes down to the incentives. If you as a society glorify athletes to the point where athletes make significantly more money, and we'll talk about this in labor markets in more detail, but take it for now as an assumption that a big part of the reason why athletes make so much money is because so many people would much prefer to watch a sporting event than read a book, or, you know, watch a game on TV or go to a game than, you know, have a discussion on another issue. Or, you know, buy a jersey for their favorite player than buy just a regular shirt. As long as society really, really values athletes, athletes will continue to make a lot of money. So put yourself in the spot of an athlete. If there's a little tiny thing you can do, you know, just give yourself a little steroid injection and just get a little bit more strength, and that strength gives you the little edge that you need to go from the minor leagues and being forgotten to being in the big leagues and making big money, well, of course people are going to take steroids. Okay? The world is full of tragic examples, and we'll go into a lot of them when we have lifetime office or lifetime lecture, but The world is full of tragic cases where good intentions have not just turned out but have turned out tragic, okay? Do not make the mistake of thinking that good intentions will lead to good outcomes. I hate to break your hearts, my friends, but it takes more than good feeling to have good outcomes. You have to think about incentives. You have to consider possible spinoffs. You have to look at how different things will motivate. You have to look at opportunity cost. It's complicated. That's why politics is complicated. That's why policy is complicated. But we've also seen firsthand what happens in politics and policy, on Wall Street, in corporate boards, when the incentives are messed up. Okay? Tied to that is an error of thinking, the old association does not equal causation fallacy. This is a simple one. Basically, just because two things happen together, that's association, does not mean that one causes the other. Okay? I have a neighbor next door. This jabroni has a rooster. Okay? I don't know how he has the rooster. He has a rooster. And every morning at like 6 o'clock, 5:45, this jamoke rooster starts crowing, and then the sun comes up. I can say safely that there is an association between the rooster crowing and the sun coming up. But I would be foolish to say that when the rooster crows, it causes the sun to come up, okay? Association is not causation. Lots of people make significant errors by thinking about those things wrong. They'll say, oh, those two things go together, and they'll make business venture investments or financial investments, and they totally blew the association causation thing and they go bankrupt, okay? A couple more. The fallacy of composition. This is another one of those things that's very subtle, but it's important. The fallacy of composition tells us it's a myth. The myth that you believe that what's good for one person is therefore good for all people, okay? This is called the fallacy of composition. And again, it's thinking, it's wrongful thinking. It's thinking that if something is good for me, then it has to be good for everybody. Or seen a different way, if one is good, then 5 is better. Sometimes what's good for one person is good for everybody. But especially in economic analysis, there's lots of cases, okay? We'll explore these in a really cool thing called game theory later on in the course. There's a lot of cases where what's good for one person is bad for the group. And what's optimal for the group is actually bad for the individual. And when that happens, you don't necessarily have good economic outcomes, okay? If we can get out of the fallacy of composition and realize that sometimes what's good for one can harm the whole, or what's good for the whole can harm the one, then we can craft better policies. We can think through difficult issues more easily and more clearly, and we can avoid that assumption that good intention leads to good outcome. And finally, I said it before and I'll repeat it again, the final pitfall to good economic thinking is forgetting or ignoring the margin. Okay, this is a marginal discipline. We believe in marginal analysis. Your questions in economics should always default to what's at the margin. When you look at the total, or when you look at the average, or God forbid, you look at the sunk cost, you're going to make an error in your thinking, okay? So at this point now, my friends, we've got 4 lectures done. You're done with Module 1. Congratulations. You should have a pretty good understanding now of what economics is and what you're stuck with, for the next 14 weeks, right? You should know what good economic thinking entails. That it's a toolbox, a set of tools that help us to make sense of an increasingly complicated world. We know that these tools are all about looking at human behavior and decision making under conditions of scarcity. And we know that if these tools are applied well, we can have an alignment between what's good for the one, the self-interest, and the social interest. And this leads to good, thriving economic outcomes. That's good economics. We also know, though, that you can have situations where your economic thinking fails. And when that happens, we get sticky situations. Part of the reason why I tend to get so animated about these things is, with all respect to your other professors, lots of academic disciplines are whiteboard disciplines. And if you make a mistake in theory, it just dies in the classroom. Economics, however, is real. And good economics can make millions of people across the world better off, more prosperous, more rights, more lifespan, more literacy, happier, healthier children, right? Economics is not a discipline that stays, in an office or a lecture hall. Good economics makes real people better. But the flip side of that is bad economics isn't just an abstract thing taught in a classroom and left alone at a graduate seminar. Bad economics and bad economic thinking hurts people. And not hurts people in the abstract, but causes famine, starvation, suffering, death, poor, worse quality of life. Okay? This is why this is such a powerful, powerful discipline. It's why I'm glad you're here with me. You're done with Module 1. I really hope that these first 4 lectures have given you a sense of how economists think, have gotten you to question some of your assumptions. I hope that every day now, whether in the little bubble of COVID or out in the world, if you venture, you're looking for economics everywhere, decisions and opportunity costs and trade-offs, okay? Incentives and alignment, voluntary trade in the gains. This is a really powerful discipline. I'm excited to share it with you over the next semester. I thank you for a great 4th lecture, and I thanks for your time in this first module. I look forward to seeing you guys soon. Keep your chins up and take care, and I'll talk to you soon. Thanks.